flight meant to be a quiet escape turned into a battleground of power, dignity, and silence. In a moment of conflict, a woman's unspoken strength challenged everything one man thought he knew about entitlement. The airplane hummed steadily as it soared through the sky, a metal bird cutting through the clouds. The flight was supposed to be uneventful, just another routine trip, but within minutes of boarding, an unsettling tension began to grow in the cabin. A black woman sat quietly in her seat by the window, eyes closed, headphones on, already lost in the rhythmic drone of the engines. She had carefully chosen her spot, a window seat she had always preferred for her quiet moments. Across the aisle, a white man, seated in the row behind her, shifted restlessly. His eyes darted between the woman and the overhead compartment, as though something wasn't quite right. She had settled into her seat without a fuss, the kind of passenger that barely draws attention, but to him there was something about her presence, a subtle, unspoken discomfort, that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the woman herself, of course. No, it was the fact that she was seated in what he believed to be his seat. He had booked his ticket early after all. He had selected his spot, and this woman had somehow, inexplicably, ended up in the seat he felt was meant for him. And though it wasn't a direct confrontation, the growing irritation in his mind began to fester. The flight attendants, busy attending to passengers and preparing the cabin for takeoff, were oblivious to the inner conflict swirling within him. He waited a few moments, then stood, looking pointedly at the woman. She didn't notice him at first, her head tilted against the seat, her body relaxed in the kind of peaceful repose that only comes with the knowledge that you are in a space where you belong. The man huffed loudly, as though to announce his presence. When she didn't immediately respond, he cleared his throat, a loud, deliberate sound that cut through the air like a warning. The woman slowly opened her eyes, glancing up at him, but she said nothing. Her face, soft but confident, displayed no sign of the anger or defensiveness he expected. He was taken aback by her calm demeanor. He had anticipated a reaction, some kind of response that would validate the discomfort he was feeling, but she didn't give him that. "Excuse me," he said, voice rising with an edge of annoyance. "This is my seat." He pointed to the seat she occupied, as though his words could transform reality itself. The woman blinked, still unbothered by his tone. Without a word, she reached up and adjusted her headphones, clearly signaling that she wasn't interested in engaging with him. But that didn't stop him. He stood there, growing more agitated by the second, and waited. He had never been one to tolerate what he perceived as disrespect, and in his mind she was defying the natural order. She had taken something from him, and he was going to make her understand that. He took a step closer, this time speaking louder. "I'm serious. I need you to move. This is my seat." His words, laced with entitlement, seemed to slice through the air like a sharp knife. Still, the woman didn't react. She was aware of his presence but refused to acknowledge him beyond the initial glance. Nearby passengers began to notice the growing tension. Whispers rippled through the cabin as others, some pretending not to watch, glanced over in curiosity. One flight attendant passing through the aisle caught wind of the altercation and made her way toward them. She attempted to mediate, asking if there was a problem, but the man cut her off with an impatient wave. "Yes, there's a problem," he said, voice rising even more. "This woman is in my seat, and she's refusing to move." His eyes locked on the flight attendants, as though his frustration alone should be enough to have her take swift action. The woman, however, remained quiet, her gaze now fixed firmly ahead, her shoulders relaxed. She wasn't going to engage. She wasn't going to let this man disrupt her calm. She had made her choice, she had settled into her seat, and no amount of his disruptive behavior would force her to change that. Her silence, like a shield, only seemed to provoke him more. The tension in the cabin built as the flight crew tried to navigate the unfolding drama. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to react. A few whispered to each other, but most just sat back, letting the situation unfold, a silent witness to something that felt disturbingly familiar. In the midst of all this, the black woman remained a still, quiet force, refusing to be swayed by the agitation of the man behind her. She sat, unmoving, a study in patience and dignity. The man's impatience was palpable. His demands grew louder, more insistent with each passing second. "I'm not going to say it again, move!" He stood over her now, his shadow falling across her seat, blocking the small light coming from the overhead compartment. The flight attendant, who had been trying to keep the peace, was now visibly uncomfortable, caught between the two passengers. She glanced from the man to the woman, unsure how to navigate the situation, unsure of how to ease the escalating tension. The woman, still calm, slowly removed her headphones. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost as if she were savoring the quiet before the storm. She turned her head toward the man, her expression soft yet firm, and said, "I'm not moving." The firmness in her voice was clear, but there was no aggression. There was no defensiveness, no hint of the anger that the man so desperately seemed to want from her. It was simply a statement of fact, a quiet assertion of her rights. He blinked, thrown off by her calmness. He had expected her to react, to become flustered, to apologize, maybe even offer to move and make the situation easier for everyone. Instead, she sat in defiance, unmoved by his demands, undeterred by his presence looming over her. His face flushed with frustration, a deep red creeping up his neck as he turned to the flight attendants for backup. "I told you, she's in my seat, she's refusing to move." His voice had a tremor to it now, as though the realization was setting in that his attempts to dominate the situation weren't working. The flight attendants exchanged a quick glance, both of them clearly uncomfortable, but one of them stepped forward and tried to intervene. "Sir, please take your seat," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "We'll resolve this." She gestured for him to sit down, but he shook his head, his posture stiff and angry. "No! You don't understand," he insisted, his finger pointing at the woman. "She's supposed to be somewhere else. She's taken my seat. You need to make her move, now." His words were sharp, dripping with frustration. He was making sure everyone around him could hear just how wronged he felt, just how inconvenienced he was. His eyes flicked over to the woman, as if daring her to do anything to challenge him further. But the woman simply met his gaze, unwavering. Her face was composed, though there was an undeniable strength behind her eyes. She was not intimidated. She had dealt with situations like this before. Perhaps not on a plane, but in 1,000 other small moments in her life, where people tried to dismiss her, diminish her, or make her feel small. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to that kind of provocation, and in this moment she was unshakable. The flight attendant, now visibly uncomfortable, spoke again, her voice slightly firmer. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat. We are trying to address the situation." She looked to the other attendant who had just returned from the galley, and then turned to the woman. "I'll need you to move, ma'am," the second attendant said, her tone a bit more polite but still carrying the air of authority. "We'll get this sorted, but please, just move so we can keep the flight on track." The woman shook her head, though her movement was gentle, like a quiet refusal rather than a confrontation. "I'm not moving," she repeated, her voice steady. "I'm in the right seat and I won't be bullied into giving it up." The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift slightly as passengers began to sense the growing tension. Some began to look away, pretending not to watch, while others leaned in, curious about the unfolding drama. The man stood there, his face tightening in disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected cooperation, a quick resolution. But instead the woman sat unmoving, serene in the face of his aggression. A few passengers exchanged glances, quietly murmuring to each other. Some looked at the man with annoyance, others at the woman with a kind of silent admiration. The woman's quiet defiance had become a subtle but undeniable stand. The more he yelled, the more he seemed to shrink in the eyes of the others, his behavior growing increasingly out of place in a space that was supposed to be shared and respected. The flight attendants, still unsure of how to proceed, hovered nearby, the tension between them and the passengers palpable. No one had expected this. No one had expected the woman to stay so composed, to make her stand so quietly and powerfully. but in that moment she had taken control, not through loud words or threats, but through simple, unshakable resolve. The white man still standing over the woman seemed to be growing more frantic. His words came out in sharp bursts, demanding action, expecting someone to do something, but the flight attendants, clearly out of their depth, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Silent conversations about how to handle this moment, this disruption that was quickly becoming something far bigger than they could manage. As the woman remained firmly seated, her silence a steady anchor in the storm of rising tension, something subtle changed in the air. A pair of eyes, unblinking and sharp, observed the scene from a few rows back. Two men seated quietly with their own drinks in hand exchanged an almost imperceptible nod. Their demeanor was calm, their eyes steady, but there was a quiet recognition in their glance that made it clear they weren't mere passengers. They were something else entirely. As the argument between the man and the flight attendants continued, one of the men in the back row stood up. He moved slowly, purposefully, as if the very pace of his walk demanded attention. His coat, slightly rumpled from hours of travel, subtly shifted to reveal a badge. Just a flash of silver, barely visible but unmistakable. The second man followed his lead, his posture mirroring the first, his eyes scanning the cabin with a cool, professional detachment. The white man, still agitated, didn't notice them at first. He was too absorbed in his own frustration, in his belief that he was the one who had been wronged, to sense the quiet shift in the room. But the woman noticed. She didn't turn her head or give any sign, but her body language subtly adjusted. A shift in the way she sat, an almost imperceptible deepening of her breath. The two men moved past the flight attendants with a quiet authority, each taking up a position on either side of the confront. They were standing just behind the man, a silent presence that was impossible to ignore now. Their stillness contrasted sharply with the growing agitation of the man, who was still insisting that the woman move, that someone do something, as if his words alone should make reality bend to his will. He hadn't yet registered the figures behind him. It was the second man who finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, yet somehow carrying through the cabin with ease. "Is there a problem here?" His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air, a question that demanded an answer. The man froze, his words stumbling as his gaze shifted over his shoulder. The recognition didn't come immediately, but it hit him hard once it did. The badges, now fully visible, were unmistakable. They were U.S. Marshals. Two of them standing just behind him, exuding an air of authority that he had been blind to until this very moment. His face paled. For a brief second his mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. The first Marshal, his voice smooth yet firm, added, "We've been observing this situation from the start." He glanced at the flight attendants who stood in the aisle, caught somewhere between relief and confusion, unsure how to process the sudden shift in authority. "It seems we have a misunderstanding." The man, now visibly deflated, looked at the woman again, his posture crumpled, his bravado vanishing like smoke. The Marshal's presence had made it clear that this was not just any confrontation. It was something that had escalated beyond what he had understood. This woman, who had been so calm and composed, was not someone he could dismiss so easily. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come out. The Marshals didn't need him to explain himself. One of them reached into his jacket, revealing a badge more fully, showing the woman in the seat next to the now silenced man. She had in some way been silently waiting for this moment, a quiet acknowledgement that her presence had been enough, that her poise had been enough to ensure the situation would not get worse. She had been prepared for the chaos, but she had never flinched. The second Marshal, now standing closer to the man, spoke again, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable authority. "You've targeted the wrong person," he said, the words like an accusation wrapped in professional detachment. "We're here to ensure the safety of all passengers. Now, I need you to return to your seat." The man, his anger evaporating into a cold, stunned realization, took a step back. His face was flushed, not with the earlier rage but with embarrassment. He stammered, his mind racing, trying to comprehend the shift, the complete and utter misstep he had made. The woman, still seated, did not look at him. Her eyes remained focused ahead, but her calm was a visible wall between them now. She had made her stand, and the marshals had confirmed it. This moment was no longer his to control. The woman had kept her composure, and now the justice she had silently awaited had come to her defense. As the marshals guided the man back to his seat, the cabin fell silent. Passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging whispers, others sitting in stunned silence. But all eyes for a moment were on the woman, whose calm had set the tone for everything that followed. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with an awkward silence, the kind that often follows an intense confrontation. The white man, now back in his seat, slumped forward, his hands clutching the armrests, as though they were the only things keeping him from sinking into the floor. His face was still flushed, the anger from moments ago replaced with humiliation. He had been certain he was in the right, certain that his discomfort could be excused, but now, he was nothing more than a man who had miscalculated. The room seemed to shrink around him, his arrogance stripped away by the undeniable presence of authority. The marshals, standing close by, had done what the flight attendants could not. They had diffused the tension without a single unnecessary word. The black woman, still seated, remained the calm center of the storm. She hadn't flinched during the altercation, hadn't let a word or a movement betray any sign of agitation. She sat with the same quiet dignity she had held from the very beginning, her posture straight, her face still composed. Yet there was an unmistakable shift in the air now, a sense of respect quietly woven into the fabric of the moment. Her presence, unmoved and unwavering, had been a silent force, and in the wake of the incident, it felt as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for her to speak, to break the silence. But she didn't. She didn't need to. The flight attendants, who had been helpless during the earlier exchange, now moved with a quiet urgency. One of them stopped by the woman's row, her movements polite but careful. She had been trained to deal with many things, but she had never been prepared for something like this. An overt act of hostility, followed by the revelation of authority so quietly delivered. The woman looked up at the attendant, her expression still calm. "Is everything okay?" the attendant asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic. The woman nodded, her eyes still focused on the aisle, though she acknowledged the attendant's presence with a small, measured smile. "Everything is fine," she said. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just moments before. The attendant hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should press further, but something in the woman's demeanor gave her pause. There was no need to explain. The woman was not seeking validation or acknowledgement, she was simply allowing the situation to resolve itself. Across the aisle, passengers had begun to shift in their seats, the tension still lingering in the air. Some looked over at the woman with newfound respect, others avoided eye contact, but none of them seemed unaffected. The man, who had been so certain of his authority moments ago, was now a shadow of his former self. He hadn't said a word since the marshals had revealed themselves. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, as if searching for some escape, some way to erase the error of his actions. The woman's silence had been a powerful statement, one that left no room for argument. The marshals had handled the situation with a quiet professionalism, leaving the man to stew in the consequences of his own behavior. The rest of the passengers, for the most part, had settled back into their seats, but it was clear that the undercurrent of what had just transpired had affected everyone. Some passengers exchanged glances, others muttered quietly to themselves, but the event had left an imprint on all of them. The woman's calm was something that seemed to radiate outward, affecting everyone around her. As the flight continued its steady course, the tension began to dissipate, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the back of everyone's mind. The woman in her quiet dignity had stood her ground, and in doing so had shown those around her that sometimes it is the refusal to engage, the refusal to be provoked, that is the most powerful form of resistance. The flight attendants, now more focused on their duties, moved about the cabin with a new sense of purpose, but their eyes would occasionally linger on the woman, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet strength she had displayed. Even the man, though he still fidgeted nervously in his seat, no longer made eye contact with anyone. His behavior had shifted from anger to something closer to embarrassment, and he seemed to understand, at least on some level, that this was not a moment he would easily forget. The woman, however, remained untouched by it all. She continued to sit quietly, her eyes occasionally glancing out the window, as the world outside remained unchanged. Her resolve, firm and unspoken, had been enough. The air in the cabin had shifted, not through confrontation or loud words, but through the simple power of standing one's ground in the face of injustice. And for now, that was enough. The tension in the cabin had settled, but it was still palpable. The white man, once so certain of his right to demand the woman's removal, sat rigidly in his seat, his eyes glued to the floor in a mix of humiliation and confusion. He had tried to dominate the situation with his loud demands, but now, in the wake of the Marshal's revelation, he was left to wrestle with the reality of his actions. He could still feel the sting of everyone's eyes on him, but now, instead of the quiet confidence he had felt moments before, he was wrapped in a sense of vulnerability. His earlier attempts to assert power over the situation had failed, and it was evident that he had underestimated both the woman and the gravity of what he had done. Across the aisle, the black woman still sat calmly, her demeanor unchanged. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, her posture unbroken, as though nothing had shifted. But anyone paying close attention could sense the subtle difference now. There was a quiet strength that surrounded her, a sense of dignity and resilience that was impossible to ignore. She had not needed to raise her voice, nor had she needed to engage in the same level of confrontation as the man. Her silence, coupled with the intervention of the Marshals, had been enough. It was as if the entire cabin had shifted in understanding, a collective recognition that her peaceful stand had become a powerful statement. The two U.S. Marshals, who had appeared out of nowhere, stood near the front of the cabin, their presence commanding. They were not loud or brash, they simply were. Their calm authority filled the space, and now the rest of the passengers, many of whom had been silent witnesses to the scene, seemed to settle into their seats, glancing nervously at one another. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, soft murmurs of disbelief and curiosity. Some passengers, once passive, now regarded the woman with an air of respect, while others avoided eye contact altogether, not wanting to be associated with the incident. The Marshals remained still, their eyes scanning the cabin as if to ensure that no further disruptions would occur. They didn't need to say anything more, their mere presence was enough. They had shown up in the right moment at the right time and had subtly taken control without uttering a single unnecessary word. Their intervention had redefined the space in which this conflict had taken place. It was no longer a small incident of a disgruntled passenger demanding something that wasn't his right. It was a moment of quiet justice, one that resonated with every single person who had witnessed it. As the flight continued, the woman's stillness seemed to take on new meaning. The incident, though resolved, had changed the energy in the cabin. The passengers had witnessed something rare, a moment where someone had refused to be intimidated, refused to be pushed aside, and in doing so, had reclaimed the power to define the terms of the situation. For many, this was an invisible victory. There were no loud cheers, no grand speeches, just a quiet, unyielding stand against an injustice that, at first, seemed small, but had the potential to spiral out of control. Meanwhile, the man who had caused the disruption now shrank further into his seat. His gaze stayed locked to the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He hadn't been the one in charge, and now he knew it. The realization had set in that his actions had been fueled not by reason or logic, but by something more insidious. A quick reflexive judgment, based on assumptions about who had the right to be in a space, and who didn't. His discomfort, once so loud and invasive, had been drowned out by the quiet strength of the woman he had tried to dismiss. And yet, despite everything that had happened, the woman didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She hadn't sought validation for her actions, and now, as the cabin slowly returned to normal, It was clear that the silent power she had wielded was enough to settle the unease in the air. Her decision to remain unshaken in the face of his aggression had become a statement, one that required no further explanation. As the plane continued its journey, the remaining passengers, who had been witnesses to the exchange, began to relax. The event had unfolded so unexpectedly, but now that the tension had dissipated, there was a sense of calm in the air. The woman still seated continued to be a quiet focal point of strength, while the man across from her, once so sure of his entitlement, now understood, perhaps for the first time, the true power of patience, dignity, and quiet resilience. The Marshals, meanwhile, subtly blended back into the background, their job done, their presence no longer needed. They had done their part, without fanfare, without raising their voices, ensuring that right had prevailed, quietly but undeniably. As the plane continued its steady course through the sky, a sense of stillness had descended upon the cabin. Passengers had slowly begun to settle back into their routines, the tension from the confrontation still hanging like a weight in the air. Some were buried in their books or screens, eager to return to the safety of their own thoughts, while others stole occasional glances at the woman, who had become, unknowingly, the subject of both silent admiration and curiosity. She had not sought this attention, but she had become the embodiment of calm in the face of adversity, and that in itself had captured the imagination of those around her. The man, now more subdued than ever, remained in his seat, his posture slouched and defeated. He hadn't spoken a word since the Marshals had intervened, and his attempts to assert control over the situation had been utterly dismantled. He kept his eyes cast downward, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, as if trying to ground himself in the reality of his miscalculation. What had started as a petty grievance over a seat had spiraled into something far more significant. His sense of entitlement had clashed with the unspoken dignity of the woman beside him, and in that moment, he had been forced to confront the limits of his own assumptions. The seat he had claimed as his had been occupied by another, but it wasn't just a matter of physical space. In some ways, the space he had wanted to control had been defined not by the physical world, but by power, and in that silent standoff he had lost. The woman, on the other hand, had not been affected in the same way. She was still seated, looking out the window with the same serenity she had carried throughout the ordeal. There was a quiet grace to her, a sense of composure that radiated outward, not in an attempt to draw attention, but in a way that seemed to say, "I am here, I belong here, and I will not be moved." She hadn't needed to escalate the situation, she hadn't needed to yell or to make demands. She had simply remained firm in her belief that she was entitled to the space she occupied, and that belief had been enough. The flight attendants, who had once seemed unsure of how to handle the growing conflict, now moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. They carried out their duties with a quiet efficiency, but their eyes, occasionally flicking toward the woman, revealed an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. The woman's calm had set a precedent, one that had made it impossible for any further escalation. The Marshals had handled the situation with such professionalism that it felt as if the storm had passed, leaving only the calm in its wake. As the flight continued, a quiet transformation took place among the passengers. The man, still attempting to hide his discomfort, began to shrink further into his seat, as though he could disappear into the very fabric of the airplane. He had been the loudest voice, the one demanding justice in what he had perceived as a breach of his rights, but now, with his power stripped away, he was nothing more than a man who had been caught in the act of his own ignorance. No one spoke to him, no one engaged him. The passengers, in their own way, had turned away from him, their attention now diverted elsewhere. The woman's presence, in contrast, became a silent point of reference. She had not needed to say anything, and yet her actions spoke volumes. She had not played into the drama, nor had she allowed the man's aggression to unsettle her. She had simply claimed her space, standing her ground without uttering a word. It was a reminder to everyone on the plane that strength did not always have to be loud or in your face. Sometimes the most powerful response was one of quiet resilience. And it was in that silence that she had shown what it meant to stand firm in one's truth, regardless of external pressures. Somewhere toward the back of the plane, two passengers exchanged a glance, their eyes lingering on the woman for a moment longer than usual. One of them leaned in and whispered something to the other, something that made them both nod in agreement. The cabin, once charged with the tension of conflict, now carried a new energy, one that felt grounded in the simple truth that justice and dignity could be defended without violence, without aggression, and without the need to prove anything to anyone. The Marshals, who had remained silent witnesses to the aftermath, now subtly began to drift back toward their seats, the calm authority they had exuded now woven into the fabric of the flight. They had done their job, and in a way that was both discreet and firm, they had ensured that what had begun as a small, individual conflict would not spiral into something larger. They had intervened, but they had also understood that the true resolution came not from force, but from allowing the woman to maintain her composure. Their actions had reaffirmed that power could be enacted through quiet strength, not through the show of dominance. And in that small, contained moment, they had taught everyone in the cabin a lesson about respect, dignity, and the strength it took to remain unshaken. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin, but there was an undeniable stillness in the air now. The earlier disruption had settled, and the passengers who had been witnesses to the tension were now left in the aftermath of what had unfolded. The woman, still seated, maintained the same quiet poise she had held throughout the ordeal. There was no sign of agitation in her demeanor, no flash of anger, or even the slightest indication that the events had rattled her in any way. Her calmness in the face of aggression had become a quiet beacon, one that held everyone's attention without a single word spoken. For some, the incident had been a revelation. The man who had once been so confident, so insistent in his right to command the space, was now reduced to nothing more than a shadow of his former self. The contrast between his behavior earlier and his retreat into shame was stark. The eyes that had once burned with entitlement now flicked nervously around the cabin, unable to find anything to cling to. The passengers around him had all but ignored him now, some casting occasional glances toward the woman, others lost in their own thoughts. Yet the man could not shake the feeling that he was being judged, not just by those around him but by his own conscience. His sense of superiority had been shattered, and in its place was the heavy weight of self-doubt and embarrassment. The woman, however, continued to sit as if she were unbothered by the change in the air. She had not engaged in any further conversation, nor had she sought any validation for her actions. She simply existed in the space she had claimed, unwavering, and her presence had a quiet gravity that seemed to shift the atmosphere of the entire cabin. Some passengers who had been caught in the initial moment of tension now watched her with a deep sense of respect. They had seen her respond to aggression not with confrontation, but with calm. She had held her ground when she was challenged, and in doing so she had taken the power back. Her silence had been powerful, almost commanding, and it had set the tone for the rest of the flight. There were no more whispers of judgment or disapproval. The incident had served as a reminder to everyone that there were moments in life when silence could speak louder than any argument, and that standing firm in one's convictions could be a statement stronger than any verbal defense. The woman had refused to be moved, both physically and emotionally, and that had been enough. The flight attendants, who had been at the center of the earlier confusion, were now moving through the cabin with an air of quiet professionalism. They no longer seemed uncertain or unsure about how to handle their duties. The power dynamic had shifted, and though the Marshals had played their part in diffusing the situation, it was the woman's composed strength that had ultimately changed the course of the interaction. They moved with purpose, but there was a softness in their steps, an understanding that this was a different flight than it had been just an hour before. One of the flight attendants passing by the woman's row paused for a moment, offering her a polite but meaningful smile. The woman acknowledged the gesture with a slight nod. It was a small moment, but it carried with it an unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened. The flight attendants had been caught in a delicate situation, one that required a balance between de-escalation and authority. But in the end, it had been the woman's quiet strength that had shown them the way. The rest of the passengers seemed to settle into a new rhythm. the initial tension giving way to an uneasy peace. Some glanced toward the woman, their expressions filled with a mix of admiration and curiosity, while others focused on their own thoughts, processing the events in their own way. It was clear that the incident had impacted everyone differently, but there was no question that the woman had left an indelible mark on them. Her poise had not only diffused a volatile situation, but had also taught everyone in that cabin something about the quiet power of dignity. And as the flight moved forward, a deeper understanding began to take root among the passengers. What had begun as a simple altercation had turned into a quiet lesson in strength, resilience, and the importance of standing up for oneself. The woman had not sought this role, but in the end, she had become an unwitting symbol of grace under pressure. In a world where conflict often demands loud responses, her ability to remain composed, to not be provoked, had spoken louder than any words ever could. And as the cabin slowly returned to its rhythm, everyone carried with them the echo of that lesson.
The atmosphere in the cabin was noticeably different now, almost serene, as if the tension had been absorbed into the very walls of the plane. The events that had transpired had altered the mood of the flight, but not in a way that could be easily articulated. Some passengers returned to their previous activities, flipping through magazines or closing their eyes to take a nap, while others remained more observant, their eyes lingering on the woman who had, without intending to, become the centerpiece of the entire ordeal. She still sat quietly, composed as ever, with her gaze occasionally drifting to the window, lost in thought or simply content with her own company. She seemed to be in a space entirely separate from the rest of the world, untouched by the ripple effect of the conflict that had momentarily engulfed the cabin. The white man, who had earlier erupted with indignation, now seemed like a man lost in a maze of his own making. He had not said a word since the Marshal's intervention. His body language betrayed an unmistakable discomfort. His shoulders were slumped, his hands still tightly gripping the armrests, as though trying to anchor himself to something solid in an environment that now felt alien. He no longer looked at anyone, not wanting to meet their gaze, and certainly not daring to meet the woman's eyes. His actions, fueled by a sense of superiority and entitlement, had been shattered, and now he was left to wrestle with the consequences. The humiliation of his behavior had replaced his previous anger, leaving him smaller in the space he had once dominated. The woman, on the other hand, continued to sit with an air of calm authority, but she wasn't seeking attention. Her posture was relaxed, and her demeanor was not at all defiant. She simply was. She had not instigated anything. She had not raised her voice or sought validation from anyone. Instead, her quiet stand had forced the world around her to adjust, to acknowledge her right to be there and to respect the space she occupied. It was a subtle but powerful statement, one that reverberated through the entire cabin. She hadn't had to explain herself, nor had she made any effort to garner sympathy or support. In this small act, she had shown that standing firm in one space could be a powerful form of resistance. Her presence had become a lesson for those who had witnessed the confrontation. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. She simply existed with dignity, and in doing so, she had given the rest of the passengers a blueprint for how to handle conflict in a world often dominated by noise and aggression. Her ability to remain unshaken in the face of such hostility was its own form of strength. For many, it was a quiet lesson in how to handle discomfort, how to confront bias without needing to prove anything. The power of her silence in that moment was enough to shift the narrative. The flight attendants, who had initially appeared rattled by the unfolding events, now seemed to glide through the cabin with an ease that had been missing earlier. Their movements were smoother, more purposeful, as if they too had internalized the lesson that had just taken place. They continued to carry out their duties with a professionalism that felt grounded, an unspoken acknowledgement of the dignity that had been displayed before them. They didn't need to say anything more. The woman's actions had been loud enough to reverberate through the entire flight, and the effect was palpable. Some passengers, once casual onlookers, now whispered quietly among themselves. The conversations were soft, the words deliberate, but it was clear that the impact of the earlier events had struck a chord. They hadn't witnessed a grand clash of wills or a dramatic confrontation. What they had seen was far more understated, a quiet but definitive assertion of boundaries, an act of strength in the form of silence. It was a moment of grace, one that had not been forced but had simply emerged from the woman's unyielding presence. The respect she had garnered wasn't because of any loud words or flashy movements. It was because she had remained unshaken, an anchor in the storm of conflict. The man, still avoiding eye contact, finally shifted in his seat, his legs crossed anxiously. He tried to return to the safety of his own thoughts, but the weight of what had happened lingered like a shadow over him. He no longer seemed certain of anything, least of all the righteousness of his own behavior. He had tried to make a scene, to demand control over something he had no right to, but the entire situation had flipped on him, and while the woman sat as still and composed as before, the rest of the cabin had changed. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle but undeniable, a change that would remain long after the plane had landed. For the woman, though, nothing had changed. She hadn't sought any victory. She hadn't sought any acknowledgement. She simply remained who she was, calm, composed, unshaken. And in doing so, she had created a lasting impact on the world around her. The flight, once an ordinary trip, had become something more, something that carried with it the reminder that power, in its purest form, often comes from the quietest places. As the plane began its descent, the city lights below began to twinkle like 1,000 tiny stars. The passengers, once caught up in the moment of confrontation, now returned to their own private worlds. The woman continued to sit quietly, her gaze still out the window, watching the horizon shift as the plane dipped lower and lower. She had not changed. Her poise had not faltered since the incident had begun. To anyone looking at her, it would seem as though she was just another passenger traveling from one place to another. But the reality was much more profound. In a few brief moments, she had demonstrated something far more powerful than any words could express. She had not just claimed her space on that plane, she had claimed the dignity that was hers by right, and by doing so, she had left an indelible mark on the people around her. The white man, now silent and withdrawn, continued to shrink into his seat, his face unreadable but marked by the shadow of discomfort. He had come into this situation believing he could bend others to his will, that the rules of the world would conform to his expectations. He had underestimated the quiet strength of the woman sitting beside him, and in doing so, he had revealed more about himself than he could have imagined. His own sense of power had crumbled under the weight of her dignity, and now he was left to reflect on what had unfolded, perhaps for the first time questioning the assumptions that had driven him to act in such a way. He had been quick to judge, quick to demand, but now that the moment had passed, he was left with nothing but the heavy realization that his actions had been fueled by something far less admirable than he had ever intended to admit. For the woman, the resolution had come not through confrontation, but through steadfastness. There had been no need to raise her voice, no need to fight back in the conventional sense. She had simply held her ground, letting her silence speak louder than any argument. It was a subtle, quiet form of resistance, but one that had carried more weight than any loud protest ever could. She had not come to the flight with any intention of making a statement. She had not sought to draw attention to herself, nor did she have any interest in being anyone's hero. She had merely wanted to exist in the space that was hers, and in doing so, had taught a lesson to those around her about the true power of quiet confidence. The flight attendants, moving down the aisles as the plane approached the runway, glanced at the woman with a sense of quiet respect. They had been there when the incident began, uncertain of how to handle the escalating tension, but they had also witnessed the way she carried herself, the way she had allowed the situation to dissolve on its own, without fanfare, without conflict. They had watched the Marshals intervene, but it was the woman's composure that had truly diffused the moment. Their own quiet nod seemed to acknowledge this. It wasn't just the woman who had diffused the situation, it was the way everyone had responded to her steadiness. She had given them all a model of how to manage conflict in a world that often seemed to thrive on chaos and noise. As the plane touched down, the final leg of the journey began. The sudden change in altitude brought with it a shift in energy, the hum of the plane's wheels touching the tarmac marking the end of this brief chapter in everyone's life. The woman gathered her belongings with a slow, deliberate calm, her actions still measured. She did not rush, did not try to stand out. She had already made her mark, and there was no need to do anything further. The moment, as fleeting as it had been, had already reverberated through the cabin, leaving behind something more lasting than any dramatic confrontation ever could. The man, still lost in his own thoughts, did not look up as the plane came to a complete stop. His movements were slow as he began to gather his own things, but there was no pride in the way he moved now, no sense of superiority. He had been brought low by a lesson that could not be learned in any classroom, no matter how many years of education or experience he had under his belt. It wasn't the Marshal's intervention that had made the difference. It was the woman's quiet, unwavering presence. The people around him would likely go on with their lives, but for him, this moment would stick. It was a moment of personal reckoning, one he would not soon forget. The doors of the plane opened and passengers began to disembark, each person carrying with them their own understanding of what had just happened. Some would talk about the incident, some would never mention it again, but in the quiet between them, a shared understanding had formed. The woman had not sought to make a scene, but she had created one nonetheless. She had demonstrated a profound truth that sometimes the most powerful action one can take is to simply be. The journey was over, but the impact of the flight, the lessons learned in that confined space, would linger long after the plane had landed and the passengers had moved on with their lives.